Hi there, and welcome to this video on GCSE Biology for the AQA Specification, focusing on animal tissues, organs and organ systems, and in particular focusing on the heart and blood vessels. I'm Shumina from StudyMind, where we help you revise GCSE Biology with our helpful video tutorials, tailored to your subject, your specification, and to you. If you're new here, make sure you click the subscribe button. Whilst you are watching, please leave any comments below if you're unsure about anything, and let us know if it's your first time watching our videos so we can send you our free revision materials. We also have helpful timestamps below for each part of the video to help guide you through the specification. So let's get started. Hello, and welcome to tutorial 2 of 7, in which we'll be looking at the heart and blood vessels. So last time we had a look at the digestive system, and so in a very similar way we're going to break down the components of the circulatory system here, or the cardiovascular system I should say, and explore this in further detail. So these are going to be our key learning objectives for today. So let's start off with looking at the structure and function of the heart. So the heart has 4 chambers, and blood is pumped between the following 4 chambers. So we have the right atrium and left atrium, and right ventricle and left ventricle. And something that you're going to have to get to grips with pretty quickly is that rights and lefts are already confusing enough, but when you're looking at a diagram of the heart or any organ in the human body, as a matter of fact, it's going to be swapped around, because what you've got to imagine is that you are looking at the patient face on. So if I were to be looking at the patient face on, I'm looking at the heart face on. So if I just divide this up into right and left, this is going to be the patient's right side, and this is going to be the patient's left side. So basically everything is reversed. So that's all you've got to remember, because you're looking at the person face on, you're looking at the heart face on. So their right is your left, and equally your right is their left. So that's how that works, so just to get that clear. And basically you have 4 chambers in your heart. You have your right and left atrium and your right and left ventricles. So let's look at how these interact with each other in terms of blood flow. Well, first of all, we start off on the right side of the body. So deoxygenated blood from the body is going to pass back into the right atrium. And this deoxygenated blood is going to be delivered by the vena cava, which is a really large vein in your body, which we'll be looking at in more detail a bit later on. So your deoxygenated blood from your body is going to pass through your vena cava and into your right atrium. And this blood is under very, very low pressure. Now, blood from your right atrium passes down into the right ventricle. And once it's in the right ventricle is going to contract, and that's going to push the blood out of the right ventricle and into the pulmonary artery. And the pulmonary artery delivers blood from your right ventricle right up to your lungs. So, just to make that clear, we've got our blood coming in here through the vena cava, passes into the right atrium, where it then passes into the right ventricle, and remember this blood is all deoxygenated. Then your right ventricle is going to contract, and the blood's going to pass up through the pulmonary artery, and it's going to go off to the lungs, where the deoxygenated blood will be oxygenated, which means that the carbon dioxide in the blood will be replaced by oxygen. So it's off to the lungs, and this blood will then return from the lungs, and it will be returned into the left atrium. Now, this blood is still under low pressure. And the same thing happens again, so the blood moves from the left atrium into the left ventricle. But remember, this time the blood is oxygenated, hence the red colour compared to the blue colour on the right side. And this oxygenated blood is now in the left ventricle, which then contracts very hard to push blood into the aorta, which is this artery over here. And the left ventricle is very thick, and it needs to be this thick, so you can see that's indicated by the size of this outline of the left ventricle. It needs to be this thick because it needs to be able to contract powerfully to generate enough pressure to eject blood from the left ventricle into the aorta, where it's then delivered to the rest of the body. So, just to recap, your right atrium is responsible for receiving deoxygenated blood from the rest of the body via the vena cava, and this blood is under very low pressure. Blood then passes into the right ventricle, which contracts to pump blood to the lungs, where the blood is oxygenated. Then blood returning from the lungs gets delivered back into the left side of the heart, so it comes back into the left atrium. And finally, it passes into the left ventricle, where it's then pumped out into the rest of the body via the aorta. So just a few common themes for you to remember here. The right side of the heart receives deoxygenated blood and pumps it to the lungs to be oxygenated. But the left side of the heart receives oxygenated blood and is responsible for pumping this oxygenated blood to the rest of the body. And similarly, we can also define different functions for the atria and ventricles. So the atria tend to receive blood from vessels, whereas the ventricles are responsible for pumping blood into vessels and delivering the blood to areas of the body. So that would either be the lungs, in the case of the right ventricle, or the rest of the body in the case of the left ventricle. So exam questions may often ask you to label the different chambers of the heart and to know their functions. So just go back through that table that we just went through, and also just recap what I said about the left side and the right side of the heart having different functions, because I think that's a really easy way of remembering what the different sections of the heart are responsible for. So now let's take a look at the other components of the heart. So we're going to have a look at the valves that are located in the heart. And valves are really useful because they stop the backflow of blood, because we only want blood pumping in one direction. It would be very inefficient if blood kept flowing backwards, because then we're not going to deliver our blood efficiently to our body's organs. So there are 4 valves in the heart. We have our tricuspid and bicuspid valve, and the pulmonary valve and the aortic valve. So the tricuspid valve lies between the right atrium and the right ventricle. And so it's responsible for preventing blood flowing back from the right ventricle into the atrium. And the bicuspid valve does the same function but on the left side. So it prevents blood flowing back into the left atrium. The pulmonary valve, in contrast, lies between the right ventricle and the pulmonary artery. So remember we said that blood is pumped from the right ventricle through the pulmonary artery through to the lungs. So to prevent backflow from the lungs or from the pulmonary artery back into the right ventricle, that's why we have the pulmonary valve. And it's exactly the same on the left side, but this time it's called the aortic valve, and this prevents backflow from the aorta into the left ventricle. And now let's have a look at the muscle tissue of the heart. So muscles are specialised depending on the area of the body that they're found in. So in the heart, we have a special type of muscle tissue called cardiac muscle. And so cardiac is the general term given to anything heart-related. So for example, heart disease may be called cardiac disease. So in the same way, heart muscle is called cardiac muscle. So if you get used to that term now, it will really, really help you. And cardiac muscle is responsible for generating the contractions required to pump blood around the body. And it's myogenic, which means that it does not tire out. And this is really, really important, because imagine when you go on a jog, for example, you'll eventually tire out and want to stop jogging. But imagine if your heart muscle did that. That would be really, really detrimental. You would die. So essentially, this muscle will never tire out. Well, obviously in old age it does, but while we're young and fit and healthy, the muscle is able to continue contracting. So this is in contrast to the skeletal muscle that's found, for example, in our legs when we're running. So the left ventricle has the highest density of cardiac muscle, and this is because it's responsible for producing the largest pressure in the heart because it needs to pump blood through the aorta into the rest of the body. But in contrast, the right ventricle doesn't have to generate as much power because it's only pumping blood from the heart to the lungs, which is a very short distance. So now let's take a look into the circulatory system. So you may have heard the circulatory system being described as a double circulatory system, and this is because blood passes through the heart twice for every complete circuit of the body. Now, the circulatory system is formed of the heart, the vessels, and the blood. And so, we have two circuits that are going on. We have the pulmonary circuit and we have the systemic circuit. So, as I said earlier, we get deoxygenated blood passing from the vena cava into the right atrium, where it then passes through the right ventricle and up through the pulmonary artery into the pulmonary circulation. And the blood is here in the lungs oxygenated, and once it's oxygenated, it's passing back through the pulmonary vein into the left atrium, then the left ventricle, and out through the aorta, pumped to the rest of the body, and this is now your systemic circuit, and eventually it comes back through the vena cava. So can you see how we're splitting this up into a pulmonary circuit up here, and a systemic circuit that delivers blood to the rest of the body. Whoopsie. Okay, so let's just explore this a little bit slower. So in the pulmonary circuit, deoxygenated blood begins in the right atrium because it's got there by passing through the vena cava into the right atrium. It then is pumped into the right ventricle and then into the pulmonary artery. And so this blood is then passed on to the lungs where it's oxygenated. And the oxygenated blood is then returned to the left atrium via the pulmonary vein. So this is your pulmonary circuit. In contrast, the systemic circuit is formed by blood being transferred to the rest of your organ systems, so hence it's called the systemic circuit. So the oxygenated blood returns from the pulmonary circuit and passes into the left atrium, then into the left ventricle, and it's then pumped via the aorta to the rest of the body. And throughout the body, the blood is going to unload oxygen and give it to the body's cells, and the body cells in return are going to unload carbon dioxide and pass it on to the blood. And the blood then flows through veins, eventually through to the vena cava, and it is now deoxygenated, and it's going to return back to the heart, where it then needs to be pumped back through the pulmonary circuit so that it can be reoxygenated. So can you see how there are two different circuits here? The pulmonary circuit and the systemic circuit. And because of this, it's a double circulatory system, because for each pump of the heart, for each circuit of the heart, the blood is going to have to pass through the heart twice, once to get to the pulmonary side of everything happening and once to get to the systemic side. So now let's take a look at the blood vessels of the heart. So we're going to go back to this diagram that we were looking at earlier. At the moment, it's got the names of your chambers and also the names of your four valves. So now let's have a look at our vessels. So we have our deoxygenated blood coming into the vena cava, and it's going to pass down into the right atrium, through the right ventricle, and up through the pulmonary artery. It's then going to go to the lungs, and once it's been oxygenated, it's going to come back via the pulmonary vein into the left atrium, then into the left ventricle, and back out through the aorta to the rest of the body. So your pulmonary artery, remember, is carrying your deoxygenated blood from your right atrium to your lungs. In contrast, the pulmonary vein carries oxygenated blood back to the heart. So just note here that this can be a tiny weeny bit confusing, because arteries in general are known to carry oxygenated blood, whereas veins are generally carrying deoxygenated blood. But in the case of the pulmonary artery and vein, it's a little bit swapped around here. So do keep that in mind and don't get confused. The aorta carries oxygenated blood from the left ventricle, which pumps it really hard through to the rest of the body. Your coronary arteries are the little arteries that go around your heart, because the heart needs to be supplied with blood as well. And your vena cava is your big vein that brings up your deoxygenated blood from the rest of your body, and it delivers it into the right atrium. So now let's take a look into our different types of blood vessels. So we've seen examples of arteries, veins, and capillaries, but they all very much vary, even though they all have similar functions. So arteries have the thickest walls out of all the blood vessels. And this is because they generally receive blood that's under very high pressure. So this means that their walls have to be elastic, which helps to maintain a high blood pressure. So they have this elastic wall that you can see here. And note that there is no need for valves in arteries, because blood is flowing so fast that there is no problem regarding backflow. So arteries carry your blood away from your heart, and in general they carry oxygenated blood, apart from the pulmonary arteries, which carry deoxygenated blood from your right ventricle into your lungs. So this just summarises what I just said. Veins, on the other hand, carry blood slowly back to the heart, and they require valves because the blood is travelling slowly, so we need to prevent backflow of blood. The veins have very thin walls and large lumens. And capillaries carry blood within organs for gas exchange. And because their function is primarily gas exchange, they are going to need to be very thin to allow diffusion of oxygen in blood to body cells. And they don't need valves. So capillaries are in general one cell wall thick, and this allows very efficient diffusion of oxygen to the body cells. So let's do a quick recap. Perhaps you can pause the video here and try filling out this table by yourself. And this is a really, really useful way of summarising the information that I've just told you. And remember, you don't have to memorise this, you can work it out from basic principles. So for example, you know that capillaries have a function in which they in which they're responsible for allowing gas exchange to occur within tissues. So when you think about the adaptations that they have for this, you know that they're going to have to need very thin walls, and that they are going to need a very narrow lumen in order to allow a short diffusion distance. So in this way you can work things out from first principles. Okay, so now let's take a look into the heart as a pacemaker. So the heart has to have a steady beating pace, and this doesn't occur by magic. Well, almost magic. So these special cells in the right atrium act as a natural pacemaker, and they ensure that the heart keeps a resting rhythm of around 70 beats per minute. And so how do these cells do this? Well, they send electrical nerve impulses through the heart muscle, and they send these nerve impulses down through the heart muscle and therefore generate contractions. But at times our heart may fail us as a pacemaker, and therefore you may know some elderly people who do have artificial pacemakers which are inserted into their body and take over this function, because it's very dangerous to have a heart that beats with an irregular rhythm, because we need blood to be regularly and reliably delivered to our organ systems. Now let's take a look into the vessels in the lung. So blood vessels pass from the heart into the pulmonary artery and then into pulmonary capillaries. Now remember, the lung is really, really important for gas exchange. We need to oxygenate our deoxygenated blood. So the pulmonary capillaries come into contact with alveoli, and this is where gas exchange takes place. So oxygenated blood travels back to the heart via pulmonary veins. So remember, I pointed out that here we have oxygenated blood travelling through veins. Whoopsie, that wasn't meant to draw. And we have deoxygenated blood through your pulmonary artery. So this might be a little bit confusing, so make sure you really understand this. So let's take a little bit of a closer look into the function of the lungs. So the lungs have two functions. Number one is ventilation, and number two is gas exchange. So ventilation refers to air just being moved in and out of the lungs as we breathe. So oxygenated air is moved in and deoxygenated air is moved out, and this occurs by diffusion. Gas exchange is its second function, and this is the movement of oxygen from the air into the blood and carbon dioxide from the blood into the air. So these are two differing functions. So ventilation means the movement of air in and out of the lungs. Gas exchange is in and out of the blood. So let's just depict this here. So we have, if this is the venous system here, we have our CO2 molecules being returned through the pulmonary artery to the lungs. And these travel into the capillaries, where they're then in very close contact with the alveoli. And we want to get rid of the carbon dioxide in the blood vessels and replace them with oxygen molecules. So we're going to do this process of gas exchange, and now there's going to be a higher concentration of oxygen in the blood, which means it's been reoxygenated and it can be passed back to the heart, into the left atrium, then into the left ventricle, and out through the aorta and pumped to the rest of the body. And meanwhile, the carbon dioxide that moved from the blood into the lungs is removed via ventilation back into the air. And you're also going to need to know a little bit about the structure of the lungs. So air enters the lungs through the mouth and the nose, and it then passes down through the larynx and through into the trachea. And the trachea splits into two bronchi, and each bronchus splits into lots of smaller bronchioles. Each bronchiole ends in lots of small alveoli, which are specialised for gas exchange. So you can imagine the lungs being around here. This is where your lungs would be. So this splitting of bronchi into bronchioles and then into alveoli is a really, really crucial structural formation of the lungs. So make sure you understand the function of each part of the respiratory system, because you may need to label parts on a diagram and then answer a single mark or a double mark question regarding its function. So now let's take a look at alveoli. So I mentioned that alveoli are the structure in the lungs that are responsible for gas exchange, and they are very, very specialised for it. So you can see how they're in a really intimate contact with their blood capillary. Look at how closely engulfed in the blood capillary they are. And so alveoli are adapted for gas exchange, firstly because they provide a large surface area, which speeds up the rate of gas exchange. They also have very thin walls, which means there's a reduced diffusion distance for oxygen molecules to pass into the blood and carbon dioxide out. They also receive a constant blood supply because they're very closely associated with capillaries, which means that they maintain the diffusion gradient needed for oxygen to pass into the blood and CO2 out. And in a similar way, they also receive a constant ventilation from the lungs, with air moving in and out. And this also ensures maintenance of concentration gradients because we need a gradient in order for the oxygen to move into the blood and CO2 out. Because remember, diffusion occurs from a high to a low concentration gradient. So now let's look at some of the adaptations of the lungs. So trachea have cartilage to keep it open. So these are the cartilage here, these rings. And this means that the respiratory airway system does not collapse, which is really, really important because if it does, then we're not going to be able to ventilate the lungs, which means that we will basically get into respiratory failure. The trachea and bronchi also have mucus and epithelia, and this ensures that we trap dust and bacteria. So make sure you know about how the alveoli and the lungs are adapted for their function, because this could also be questioned. And finally, we're going to have a look at some rate calculations for blood flow. So remember, a rate is always calculated by measuring the change in something over time. So here we're looking at the change in blood passing through a particular area over time. So if we wanted to calculate the rate of model A, we would have to do the volume of blood, which is 100. Always put your units in, centimetres cubed, over 2 minutes. And that's going to give you your answer of 50 centimetres cubed per minute. Now, does that make sense? We're doing the volume of blood over time elapsed. Now, in a similar way, could you please calculate the rate of model B and model C? So for model B, you should have done 143 over 2, which would have given you your answer of 71.5 centimetres cubed per minute. And the same for C, you should have done 127 over 2, which is 63.5 centimetres cubed per minute. And remember, as I said in the last tutorial, if you're ever confused about what units to use, simply just plop your units from your table into your equation. So in the same way, it would be volume of blood, which is centimetres cubed, over number of minutes, which is measured in minutes. So that's how we know that our units are centimetre cubed per minute. But how would you calculate each rate in centimetres cubed per second? Well, all you'd have to do is convert this into seconds. So 2 minutes is equivalent to 120 seconds. Sorry, it's not writing my S. So that means you should have got 0.83 centimetres cubed per second for model A, (1.19 centimetres cubed per second for model B, and 1.06 centimetres cubed per second for model C. And the way I did that was again the same, by just dividing blood passed over time elapsed, but this time in seconds. So really well done for today. We covered a lot, and I'll see you for tutorial number 3. Thanks for watching this free video from StudyMind. If you liked this video, make sure to subscribe to catch our newest videos by clicking below, and leave a comment on a topic you'd like a video on. Click here to watch more videos in our series for GCSE Biology, or visit our website studymind.co.uk for free past paper compilations by topic and specification.